je vous présente. En tout cas, bienvenue dans ce colloque. Vous êtes un professeur d'excellence en philosophie, Lydiane et Maurice Moss à l'Université de Memphis et professeur à la School of Liberal Arts de l'Université de Wollongong. Vous avez 45 minutes pour présenter votre exposé. Voilà, donc nous le découvrons. Il s'intitule « Le pragmatisme en sciences cognitives, avant et après l'enactivisme ». Bienvenue, nous sommes prêts à vous écouter.
So first, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Second, I want to say that I'm experiencing some internet connection problems, and I'm hoping that nothing will go wrong during the talk. It's been wobbly this morning for some reason. Okay, and finally, I'm going to simply try to stick with the text on my slides to facilitate the translations. So, in recent years, some number of people have talked about a pragmatic turn in cognitive science, and there's a list of people that I could point to, including myself. The general consensus on this is that this turn or return to pragmatism is closely tied to the turn within cognitive science to non-representational embodied cognition, specifically some versions of fore cognition, especially enactive versions. Here, for example, is Andreas Engel and colleagues, and they say, in cognitive science, we are currently witnessing a pragmatic turn away from the traditional representation-centered framework towards a paradigm that focuses on understanding cognition as enactive, as skillful activity that involves ongoing interaction with the external world. In some regards, this pragmatism or this pragmatic turn is just this turn to embodied action-oriented cognition that came to the fore starting in the 1990s. Still, I'm going to argue that this is an oversimplification in a number of ways. And first, it's an oversimplification in regard to the actual timing, the kind of historical position of this turn. Second, in regard to the fact that pragmatism may have already been influencing mainstream cognitivists even prior to this turn to embodied cognition. And third, in regard to how different versions of pragmatism relate somewhat, I think, unevenly to the variety of fore theories. So here is an outline. I'll start by talking a little bit about the lag time, and then I will simply go on to talk about some connections between pragmatism in mainstream cognitive science and philosophy of mind, and finally how pragmatism relates to the variety of embodied cognition theories. So that's pretty much the outline. So I'll start with this idea of a lag time. In regard to timing, anything that resembles a self-conscious pragmatic turn in the embodied cognition camp doesn't really correlate to the emergence of embodied cognition approaches. If we review the early works on embodied cognition, there is rarely a mention of the pragmatists. Varela, Thompson, and Roche in the 1990s, early 1990s, for example, make one general reference to pragmatism, but really they leave it undeveloped, and they don't directly relate it to the actual embodied and activist aspects of their work. Likewise, even in later texts associated with enactivism, and here's a list of names, including myself, but as well as Alvin Noe, Evan Thompson, Hutto and Mayan, there is no mention of the pragmatists like Peirce, Dewey, or Mead. And when James is mentioned, it's not really James the pragmatist, it's more James, the author of the Principles of Psychology. So Andy Clark starts his book on the extended mind with an invocation from Dewey. He fails to exploit any further connection with pragmatism or to mention Dewey or the pragmatists in any of his earlier works. So it's a kind of one-off citation, which doesn't really get integrated seemingly with his work. That's in 2008. Significant mentions of the pragmatists in these contexts, however, does start just around this time. 2007, for example, Richard Minari exploits pragmatist themes to frame his understanding of the extended mind. He appeals to Dewey's notion of organism-environment transactions to work out a characterization of how embodied cognitive processes incorporate the environment. And he also references Peirce's continuity principle to counter the idea of a metaphysical discontinuity between the mind and the world. Then in 2008, and again in 2010, Pierre Steiner points out the affinity between Dewey's account of experience and externalist approaches, including extended mind and enactive accounts of cognition. Mark Johnson in 2008 starts to celebrate Dewey and equates the latter's notion of transaction with enaction. So I think this association between pragmatism and the embodied cognition really starts to gain traction just around that time. And you can see it's picked up in Chamorro in 2009, as well as in another work by Minari, and in some of my own work. Johnson continues this idea, and then you find it in DiPaolo, Berman, and Barandarian in 2017. Accordingly, if the pragmatic turn is measured by the mention and the use of the pragmatists, the turn is made only some 15 years after the initiation of embodied cognition, including enactive views, which began in the early 90s. Now, of course, mention of the pragmatists may just be an explicit measure of the pragmatic turn, and one could argue that embodied cognition and enactive approaches have always been implicitly pragmatist. But if so, it's odd not to have some more explicit association. Okay, so I now want to turn to think about how pragmatism actually has had a kind of ongoing influence in the history of cognitive science. The turn to pragmatism in embodied cognition does not really signal something new in cognitive science. Elements of pragmatism influence, implicitly at least, but also explicitly, debates about cognition that predate embodied cognition, and indeed from the very beginnings of the classical cognitivist regime. That some taste of pragmatism was at least implicitly in the mix or in the background in some of the earlier debates about representation and cognition can be noted in connection with Gibson's ecological view. Certain aspects of Gibson's work were influenced by pragmatism, and we have a number of people who make this point. This aspect of pragmatism figures into the debate that Gibson has with Fodor and Pleishin, and really, in a certain sense, is the key part of the opposition that they have with Gibson's work, and in contrast then to what they define as the establishment view of cognitivism. So it's clear that that Gibson is influenced by the pragmatists, and it figures into at least some of his work, but it's something that comes to be clearly rejected by Fodor and Pleishin. Although Fodor and Pleishin admit of a limited conciliatory reading of some of Gibson's points, they reject what could be most associated with pragmatism. I think this debate is familiar to most of you. For Fodor and Pleishin, Gibson's notion of direct perception as information pickup is overly promiscuous, since it implies that we would pick up anything that catches our eye. Perception, according to Fodor and Pleishin, requires constraints. It needs to be selective. And this kind of constraint comes by way of internal, representational, or inferential processes for them. The conciliatory point for them is something like the idea that, well, some kind of direct pickup, what they would refer to as transduction in the primary sensory processes, is necessary. But equally necessary is the selectivity that involves representation and inference. The question is whether we should think of the required selectivity process conceived as active orienting, exploring, investigating, attuning, and so forth, as built into the affordance structure of the organism-environment relation, as Gibson and the pragmatists would hold, or to be the product of an internal representational process working with impoverished premises generated by transducers more narrowly construed, as Fodor and Pleishin would have it. Fodor, however, I think remains narrow-minded, narrow in that kind of technical philosophical term. It's clear that the pragmatic elements of Gibson's theory are, for Fodor and Pleishin, not the points of conciliation. And later, Fodor, of course, complains about pragmatism. He says that pragmatism was the defining catastrophe of analytic philosophy of language and philosophy of mind in the last half of the 20th century. Its attempts to do without a theory of representation is, he says, a shambles from which philosophy has yet to fully recover. So note that this Fodor-Gibson debate happens well before the 1990s and the advent of embodied cognition. And even Fodor's later critique of pragmatism is still several years before what some people identify as the pragmatic turn. Over a decade before this debate between Gibson and Fodor, the developmental psychologist Jerome Bruner, who helped to launch the field of cognitive psychology and who proposed the concept of, he used the term enactive, action-based representation, was influenced indeed by pragmatism, and specifically by John Dewey. In an essay on language and experience, Bruner reflects on the revolutionary work of Chomsky and notes that Chomsky overlooks some of the more important aspects of language, those precisely that were context dependent. This context dependency of language and the ideas that linguistic practices necessarily reflect the circumstances are ideas that Brunner finds in John Dewey. For Brunner, this sort of comes to light again at a conference in London in 1975, the Third International Child Language Symposium, where he emphasizes language as performance and the importance of intersubjective interaction for the child's acquisition of speech. And he says in the paper that's published from that conference in 1977, he says, as Dewey says, communication by itself does not accomplish anything. Insofar as the dialogue between mother and infant succeeds in getting the child to fill his role in exchange, the child is in fact learning not so much a language as how to proceed in achieving certain ends by the use of language. The input is not a corpus and the output is not the grammar. By the way, Brunner in this paper cites the work of David McNeill in a paper by McNeill in 1975, whose theory of gesture later figures into discussions of embodied cognition, enactivism, and extended mind in, for example, my own work, but also in Clark. So I think it's noteworthy that much earlier, Grace de Laguna's work on speech is something that has an influence on Brunner here. And Brunner cites her work, and in so doing, gestures, perhaps he's aware of this connection with pragmatism or not, but he gestures to a deeper philosophical connection with pragmatism that continues to hover in the background, shaping the philosophy of science that was immediately informing the cognitive revolution. De Laguna, along with her co-author and husband, Theodore de Laguna, had early on engaged critically with pragmatism. They have a paper together in 1910 where they offer some critical comments on pragmatism, but also in a certain way show how much influenced by pragmatism they were. Okay, what's going on here? Oh. Nonetheless, the pragmatist view is central to their evolutionary epistemology and confirmation holism, or what Fodor would call concept pragmatism, which is simply the idea that concepts, apart from the conduct which they prompt, mean nothing. So concepts are closely connected with conduct, something that, of course, Fodor would criticize, but this is something that the de Lagunas embrace. If they were not pragmatists, and indeed they were being critical of pragmatism in some respects, you might say that in this regard they were perhaps the first neo-pragmatists. Now, importantly, there's a connection here between the work of Grace de Laguna, especially, and the work of Willard Quine, who is, well, we can debate whether or not he's pragmatist, but he might be a quasi or neo-pragmatist. And there's a clear connection. Both Grace de Laguna and Quine contributed papers to the same 1950 American Philosophical Association Eastern Division Symposium, which were subsequently published together in the Philosophical review. Quine's paper is quite famous. It's the paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. That's what he delivered at the APA when Grace de Laguna was on the panel with him. And in this paper, he suggests there is, quote, a shift towards pragmatism. And this paper turned out to be highly influential. As David Chalmers points out, it's one of the most influential works in the 20th century philosophy. Like the de Lagunas, Quine also defends confirmation holism. Again, the idea that no concept or theory can be verified in isolation, since it is embedded in a background or a web of other concepts and beliefs, including other scientific theories. Joel Katzev argues that an even more sophisticated version of this idea is to be found in the de Laguna critique of pragmatism, and moreover in a formulation that incorporates the pragmatist linking of concept and conduct. Again, going back to the 1910 essay by de Laguna and de Laguna, our thoughts direct our content, or sorry, our thoughts direct our conduct. And it is this service that in this service that their meaning ultimately consists. But every concept means both more and less than any particular application that it contains. Likewise, they hold that part of the meaning of any concept involves a reference to experience. They say along the edges or on the periphery of the web, the conceptual web, there is this experience such that the concept is judged by its ability to control conduct. Although concepts of logic have a greater autonomy from experience. So more abstract concepts perhaps are less connected to experience, but nonetheless, the pragmatic point here is that they are connected to experience, and experience specifically with respect to conduct or behavior. And Quine makes a very similar point in 1953. Okay, here again, the very top line is blocked for me. We have always something or other in accordance with which we interpret each new matter of fact. And though any one of these beliefs may at some time be called into question, this is always on the supposition of the acceptance of a host of others. Science, accordingly, can never be a system of judgments with one-way relations of implication. Our judgments support one another. And when, as occasionally happens, they contradict one another, there's no ultimate standard of imperishable truth by which they can be tested. This is from a paper by Theodore de Laguna in 1930. And it fits nicely, I think, here with the pragmatic view. Theodore de Laguna explicitly states that his views were directly influenced by James and Dewey. Right, and there's also some connections to be made between James and Quine along this line. Now, whether we consider Quine to be a pragmatist or not, and there's some debate about that among a variety of people, Quine's naturalism and empiricism are really views widely shared in cognitive science. And that means there is no hard line, on Quine's famous idea. There's no hard line between science and philosophy, and Quine attributes this idea to the influence of Dewey. He says, philosophically, I am bound to Dewey by the naturalism that dominated his last 3 decades. With Dewey, I hold that knowledge, mind, and meaning are part of the same world that they have to do with, and that they are to be studied in the same empirical spirit that animates natural science. There is no place for a prior philosophy. As Hilary Putnam puts it here with respect to Quine, he says, like Quine, the classical pragmatists do not believe that there is a first philosophy higher than the practice that we take most seriously when the chips are down, by which he means the practice of science. So I think this part of pragmatism is imported directly into the cognitivist camps of cognitive science. So Patricia Churchland, for example, follows Quine just on this point. Philosophy, she says, at its best and properly conceived, is continuous with the empirical sciences. So definitely Quine is hovering in the background of Churchland's ideas, but hovering in the background of Quine are James and Dewey. So this also leads to debates, and these are debates that have to do with some fundamental concepts that are basic to cognitive science. So, for example, starting in the 1970s, there's a debate between Putnam and Richard Rorty about the relevance of pragmatism and neo-pragmatism. And these debates about pragmatism run along simultaneously with their debates about functionalism in the philosophy of cognitive science. Putnam, of course, is well known. He had a significant influence on the development of the concept of functionalism in cognitive science in the 1960s. But he started to explore the ideas of pragmatism in James and Peirce in the 1980s, for example. And this included Peirce's idea that a concept or a belief was not something one simply entertains in one's mind in a propositional form, but something on which one is prepared to act, or something equivalent to the consequence of the habit that it is calculated to produce. A view, really, that is not alien to the more recent embodied action-oriented views of cognition. And by the time that Putnam gives up his own earlier version of functionalism, or the functionalist view, for a more, what he calls, liberal version, the pragmatism that he studied throughout the 1980s remains, let's say, implicit, but nonetheless, I think, discernible in his emphasis on the role of the physical and social environment in cognition. Okay, so there can be debates about whether Quine should be considered a pragmatist. Everyone actually acknowledges that it's very difficult to define pragmatism, or to say who counts as a pragmatist. But just as sure as Jerry Fodor never was and never could be considered a pragmatist, one could make a good argument that Dan Dennett is a pragmatist. There is perhaps a vague line of pragmatism that runs from William James's essay, Does Consciousness Exist?, directly to Dennett's Consciousness Explained. The point here, however, is not about lineage, but about strategy. So Bjorn Ramberg makes a clear argument about this, which may help to explain why Consciousness Explained, Dennett's book in the 1991, appears to some as Consciousness Explained Away. And Ramberg says, Dennett's view is that the linguistic practices in which our notion of consciousness is embedded, the vocabulary from which the philosophical invention qualia takes its intuitive power, are practices we would do well if we want to naturalize our conceptions of ourselves, we would do well to alter. But this, any pragmatist knows. We can do only insofar as we are able to make satisfying alternative descriptions available. In other words, Dennett adopts a pragmatist strategy, what Quine had called the interpretivist strategy. There might be hermeneutics hovering in the background here too. Pragmatist interpretivism regards ontological intuitions about the mind as vocabularies to be deconstructed. So Ramberg puts it this way: naturalistic pragmatists like Quine and Dennett are proposing ways to describe ourselves as thinkers and agents that make the philosophical contrast between mind and matter seem to be without any particular ontological point. Dennett is forever trying to undercut our armchair intuitions about the mind, mainly by appealing to empirical science and sometimes, as you know, to humor. This interpretivist strategy makes him, I think, an unheralded pragmatist. That might be putting it more in the way Rorty would put it than Dennett would put it, but Rorty also sees Dennett as a pragmatist in just this way, and of course Rorty approves of it. And Dennett responds in 1982 with a bit of humor, agreeing that he is a pragmatist, more or less 72.4%. So a significant, at least, figure in terms of identifying as a pragmatist. The point of this quick and incomplete sketch of how some elements of pragmatism already inform discussions in cognitive science and philosophy of mind prior to the emergence of embodied cognition is intended to qualify any strong claim about the novelty of a pragmatic turn in connection with embodied cognition. In some ways, cognitive science has always turned on some very basic pragmatist concepts that continue to inform the philosophy and practice of studying the mind. So this last part really is an attempt to, well, to say something, but nothing real definitive here about how pragmatism does fit with the variations of embodied cognition that you find in the literature. So I've returned now to what was called the pragmatic turn. I've noted first, in terms of timing, there was not a complete coincidence between the development of embodied cognition approaches and any turn to pragmatism. And second, I've provided a brief sketch of some of the elements of pragmatism to be found in cognitive science and philosophy of mind prior to the advent of embodied cognition. My third task then is to indicate how pragmatism relates to the variety of embodied cognition theories. Here we can start with an essay by Mark Johnson and Tim Rohr, who trace the rejection of the mind-body dualism from pragmatists like James and Dewey into the recent embodied cognition theorists. They take this rejection as also a rejection of the representationalist theory of mind and the establishment of a pragmatically centered cognitive science. In place of representation, the pragmatists offer an emphasis on action, treating cognition as a kind of action as a response to problematic situations. Johnson and Rohr indicate three different principles that derive from pragmatism and that inform embodied cognition. First, the explanatory unit is organism environment rather than brain. We've heard that before at this conference. And they cite Dewey. They're constantly quoting Dewey. Dewey suggests to see the organism in nature, the nervous system in the organism, the brain in the nervous system, the cortex in the brain. That is the answer to the problems which haunt philosophy. A second, principle of continuity, again citing Dewey, who says there is no breach of continuity between operations of inquiry and biological operations and physical operations. Continuity means that rational operations grow out of organic activities without being identical with that from which they emerge. Johnson and Rohr, for example, think that this fits rather well with the concept of autopoiesis. And third, the environment is not just physical, but also social. And this means that multiple agents can cooperate in response to current or anticipated problems. And once again, they suggest pragmatists such as Dewey have taken this complex kind of social interaction as emblematic of cognition par excellence. Although Johnson and Rohr associate these pragmatic principles with enactivist views, they cash out most of them in ways that remain close to what has been called weak embodied cognition of the form found in people like Goldman or Barcelo, who emphasize B-formatted neural representations, or what Vittorio Galese calls embodied simulation. So Johnson and Rohr link their analysis to image schemas and neural maps as a way to explain higher order thought. They argue that image schemas are formed as different sets of neurons as they compete to become topological neural maps driven primarily by regularities in the environment. The maps code perceptual space in a topological fashion, but also increasingly they allow for abstract topological structure so that, as Johnson and Rohr put it, we live in the world of our maps. Topologically speaking, our bodies are in our minds in the sense that our sensory motor maps provide the basis for conceptualization and reasoning. So I take this to be a very weak type of embodied cognition. They of course reject the strict representationalist interpretation of these maps, and they argue that, quote, actual neural representations are perpetually situated in dynamic organism environment interactions. Whether there is a better way to think about this, or to think about how the brain actually works, that's a matter of debate, an ongoing, interesting, fascinating debate, I think. But neural maps or representations, I think, clearly map onto these versions of weak embodied cognition or embodied simulation, but it's not clear how much they reflect pragmatist principles or come really close to enactivist ones, despite Johnson and Rohr's attempt to make them that way. So let's consider a little bit stronger version of embodied cognition under the kind of heading of rethinking representation. And here, again, Richard Minari comes into play. With respect to the question of representation, this is Minari in 2015, he reminds us that Peirce proposed a developed account of representation that is neither the strict Fodorian kind, nor the kind of minimal action-oriented kind that you find in someone like Clark. Peirce does not conceive of representation as a vehicle carrying information or semantic content, or as a stand-in for an object. Rather, he emphasizes continuous dynamical interpretation. Peirce's notion of representation involves what's called sign action. In the simplest terms, a sign is produced by a mechanism or agent. Some other mechanism or agent, a consumer, attunes to it, thereby accomplishing something, leading to some end. The sign counts as a representation in Peirce's sense of the term. The representational process, right, I can't, again, read that top line. You can. Picking up at coordination of producer and consumer mechanisms for some further end. Therefore, it requires either the coordination of mechanisms within the organism or the coordination of a mechanism in the organism with a mechanism in that organism's environment. This view makes no commitment as to whether the sign action must be internal, external, or distributed across brain, body, and world. So Minari understands this view to be consistent with the Peircean concept of abduction or exploratory inference, and he takes this to be similar to Bayesian or predictive processing accounts of active inference. In any case, the pragmatic version here of this idea, steers us away from internalist and avowedly non-pragmatist models of the sort found in, for example, Jacob Haue's predictive processing idea, where the brain, isolated from the world, tries to infer the causes of its sensory input while minimizing prediction errors, with the aim of maintaining a veridical representation of the world in the head. Pragmatist versions rather push towards a more externalist, Clarkean conception of active inference, according to which action is needed to minimize prediction errors by optimizing the states of brain, body, environment. So a slightly more liberal version of embodied cognition. We can take a look at a slightly stronger version also. If, as Johnson and Rohr suggest, pragmatism can inform weak versions of embodied cognition, Engel and colleagues propose that it can also inform stronger versions, here under the heading of rethinking action orientation. Engel et al. Emphasize the action-oriented perspective, moving away from representationalism and suggesting that cognitive processes are so closely intertwined with action that cognition would best be understood as enactive or pragmatic. So this is in the work where it's entitled Pragmatic Turn. And they say the term pragmatic is used here first to highlight our conjecture that cognition is a form of practice. Second, we introduce the term to refer to action-oriented viewpoints, such as those developed by the founders of philosophical pragmatism, and they cite here Dewey and George Herbert Mead, albeit without suggesting a return to exactly the positions put forward by these authors. Engel and colleagues take this a step further towards a pragmatic enactivism, at least for basic perception, action, cognition. So rather than talk about representations, they'll talk about dispositions for action embodied in dynamic activity patterns. Such dispositions are not simply neural events, but include extra neural patterns enacted by the body as it couples to the environment. Accordingly, they say, knowing what an object is does not mean to possess internal descriptions of this object, but to master sets of sensory motor skills and possible actions that can be chosen to explore or utilize the object. Well, if this is a path that moves us towards a stronger enactivist embodied cognition, it's not always clear how far along that path pragmatism, or at least some version of pragmatism, can get us. Engel et al. Agree with Johnson and Rohr, and they all highlight the role of cortical maps. They point to a great deal of empirical evidence to show how such maps critically depend on sensory motor interactions and active exploration of the environment. And again, like Johnson and Rohr, Engel and colleagues would eschew any kind of strict Fodorian representation. So if neuroscientists have license to refer to neural representations or maps, at most we should just think of them as simple covariations between brain and environment. And in this respect, Engel and colleagues, very much, again, like Minari at this point, point to Andy Clark's concept of action-oriented representation and the idea that brain states prescribe possible actions rather than describing states of the outside world. I want to move at the end here to an even stronger embodied cognition under the heading of rethinking the whole system. So perhaps to lay down another step on this path, we need to return beyond the pragmatic turn and beyond neo-pragmatism to old pragmatism to find a productive clue that has nothing to do with representations or maps, and that I think seems closer to enactivist views. Here's maybe a familiar quotation, longish quotation from John Dewey. He says, "The advance of physiology and the psychology associated with it have shown the connection of mental activity with that of the nervous system. Too often, recognition of connection has stopped short at this point. The older dualism of soul and body has been replaced by that of the brain and the rest of the body." But in fact, right, blah, 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 I can't see that part. The mechanism for keeping all bodily activities, the brain, of course, is the mechanism for keeping all bodily activities working together. Instead of being isolated from them as an organ of knowing from organs of motor response, it is the organ by which they interact responsively with one another. The brain is essentially an organ for effecting the reciprocal adjustment to each other of the stimuli received from the environment and responses directed upon it. Note that the adjusting is reciprocal. The brain is not only enables organic activity to be brought to bear upon any object of the environment in response to a sensory stimulation, but this response also determines what the next stimulus will be. You may be familiar with, in the late 19th century, his early essay on the reflex arc concept in psychology, where he really, shows much clearer this type of idea. And of course, we could just throw in here Thomas Fuchs' notion of circular causality instead of this kind of talk about reciprocity. Although reciprocity is not a bad thing, not all causal relations in this regard are reciprocal. Causality is much more dynamical, I think, than just that. So here's my conclusion. I've argued that in regard to the pragmatic turn, the timing doesn't coincide precisely with the advent of enactivism or embodied cognition more generally. Moreover, within the boundaries of cognitive science and philosophy of mind, the traditional boundaries, let's say, pragmatism would not have an exclusive link with enactivism, since it was already influencing mainstream cognitivists even prior to the advent of embodied cognition. And finally, relations between pragmatism, fore, and enactivism, and those views are complex. Different versions of pragmatism relate somewhat unevenly to the variety of fore theories. I think there's a lot more work to do along that line to clarify some things, but I think this is enough for today. Thank you very much.